Good morning, right up our alley. Persephone Jane here, and I thought I would start a little series on writing exercise. I have, more than I care to admit, days where the story just isn't in me. For whatever reason, I just don't have it. But when I'm focused towards a goal of completing this story on a deadline or a timeline of some kind, I still want to be proactive in that particular story. Previously, I would just pick up a different story and I would work on that one for the day. It didn't matter. But I find now I have a goal of finishing a particular story at a particular time for, publishing reasons and things like that. So I feel like it's wasteful if I don't stay on task with that story. So how do I get around that? And I found writing exercises to be kind of the answer for me. The side note is that they double as potential word count bolsters. I will do a story exercise, and sometimes I will find little nuggets or even entire scenes that I now want to work into the novel. And so that kind of extra bonus helps as well. So I'm thinking I'm going to do a little series on this because there's so many opportunities for story exercises. So today we're going to focus on history and how we can use the history to better understand our characters and potentially bolster word count. All right, so first is personal history. The history of your main character, obviously, but also the history of a lot of the supporting characters. I read a quote somewhere at some point that said, treat each of your supporting characters as if they think the story is about them, right? Because everyone is in their own story. We come and go out of other people's stories and we add or subtract to and from them, but our story is about us. And the same would be true in books, that yes, it's a main character story, but all the supporting characters also have their own stories. And so for you to sit down and think about anybody's history, personal history, is going to be beneficial to the way that you understand your characters, and that comes through in the book, and also the way that you understand how they're going to see the world. So personal history. Second is relationship history. Do they have a good relationship history in general? Like, do they, meet people and have good friendships or good relations? Do they piss people off a lot? Do they ostracize people? Do they judge people and that affects their relationships? So in general, what are their relationships like? But also specifically, what are their personal relationships? Were they close with their family? Did they have a lot of siblings? Did they grow up with both of their parents? Were they an orphan? Were they a runaway? Which creates an orphan, but for a completely different set of circumstances, thus changing your character. So all of these little things, that kind of tie into their personal history, but influence their relationships. How do they treat people? How do they prefer to be treated? What kind of people do they gravitate towards as far as relationships? Do they have any romantic relationships, past, present, or will they in the future? So relationships can help you decide how they interact with the world. 3, the history of a land or place. For example, the history of a natural lake could lend to story qualities. If the lake was man-made, it's going to feel different, it's going to look different than if it was naturally formed. If it's a new lake, it's going to have a different ecosystem than if it's a long-established lake. So something as simple as that to, the history of a land such as America that used to be populated by indigenous peoples, and then, the Pilgrims came and it's a whole different route that history took. So all of those types of things, naturally, the history of a land, but then culturally, the history of a land can also make a really big difference. 4, the history of an object. In fantasy stories, a lot of times the history is more important because that history is usually tied with some kind of magical happenstance. But even in more realistic stories, the history of an object can have not only great symbolism to add to your story, but it can affect the characters in a lot of ways. For example, a prized family watch that escaped, World War I or II and made its way to America in some, crazy circumstance. My band teacher, as a high schooler, he came to this country with only a clarinet in his hand. That clarinet is meaningful to him, and he played it, and he ended up becoming a really, really good musician on many different instruments. And so that one particular instrument for him, and potentially for his family, and for his story, could be a significant thing to know the history of that particular object, because he's going to treat it differently, he's going to protect it, he's going to be more upset if it's lost. And so knowing the history of a certain object can help you understand how your character or the world is going to relate to that object. 5, the history of a nation. That I feel like it's self-explanatory, but at the same time, maybe it's not. We as Americans are a very young nation if you look at the history of the planet, and I think that shows. I think what we're doing now is maybe kind of equating to a midlife crisis of sorts. I don't know what plane of development, so to speak, our country would be in if we were to equate it to that. But you can see the difference in the way that cultural history has shaped the mindsets of the people. So if you're in a fantasy story, or if you're in a world that you've made, you have to think about those things. You have to create those things. You don't have them from real history to just draw from and create from. You have to make them yourself. So thinking about the history of a particular nation is going to bolster your understanding of your own world. And again, it doesn't have to be a detailed history. It can be a simple outline. And as you go along and you revisit that, or things come up and you want to add some backstory, maybe you'll put notes in your outline that kind of bolster it and give it a little more substance. And that's okay. So those are 5 histories that you can use as a story exercise for your project. Some of them might bonus into word count for your actual novel, but really they're just there for you to get a better understanding of your characters and your world. A quick 6th bonus history: spiritual history. A person's own personal spiritual growth or history can have a big impact in how they interact with the world. I know personally for me, it had a huge impact being raised in one very particular religion and consciously choosing to leave it behind for something that felt more real and more meaningful to me has drastically changed not only the way that I view spirituality, but the way I view the world in general. So if it's true for me, then it can be true for other people. It can be true for your characters. So spiritual or religious history is another thing to consider when you're thinking about your world and your characters, and maybe looking for a story exercise that you can work on without having to actually write in your story. Side note, be careful not to use your story exercises as procrastination from your writing. This video and any others that I make of it, of this series in the future, they're meant for you to have a few tricks in your bag to help you get out of what we might call writer's block, to help you inspire your story, to help you rekindle a flame and get you going. If you're writing your story exercise and you get inspired, go ahead, drop your story exercise, pull up your manuscript and type in whatever you're inspired to type. If it's just a few lines, that's okay. Maybe the few lines will help you. Type it in, get it out. Once it's done, go back to your story exercise. That's okay. But don't use your story exercise as a procrastination and a way to avoid the writing, kind of like we do research. Don't use your story exercise in that way. My personal advice is to not. because obviously the whole goal is to complete the book. And hopefully these little tips on history will help you get there. If you have some histories that you have used to bolster your story or deepen your understanding of characters, please drop them in the comments below and let us know. We would love to not only hear your comments, but maybe implement them into our own writing habits. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.